All right.
Micah Jack, we're going to talk about one of our favorite figures from church history.
Yes, we are.
Richard Allen. Yeah, and we'll talk Fred Douglass too, because we like that as well. So this conversation really went back to the class that you had with me, Christianity and Culture, looking for a topic to study. And you said, I don't think I know a lot about Black church history.
Yeah.
Where do I start? And I said, well, Richard Allen's a good place to start. And we're both Philly guys. Richard Allen was a Philly guy, so that kind of connected. I've always enjoyed, I love his story. I love it and hate it at the same time, right?
Yeah.
It's a great story of triumph of the Black church, and it's a sad story about how the white church and Black church were not united. So, I mean, my first question is like, what drew you to Richard Allen? Why study him? Why is he important? Why do we need to know who he is?
I think what drew me to Richard Allen was, in one of the lectures, he was someone that you had mentioned, and his famous walkout of St. George's Church. With the other African Americans who were alongside him because they weren't being allowed to worship. And not only a way fitting for a Christian, but honestly just fitting for any human being. Not allowed to pray. In one of the books I read, it mentions they were made to stand up during their prayer and move to another section. And so that was something I wanted to begin to look at just to kind of get a foothold. I didn't know that we'd end up where we've ended up and just continue to study, continue to read and learn more and more about these things. But yeah, that was kind of what drew me in. He seemed like, I think in a lot of ways he's a symbol of a lot of the issues and a lot of the concerns that were happening, especially when you talk about Christianity in the church and race relations in that time. You can learn a lot of principles and see a lot of sin and evil in his life that was pretty consistent throughout the entire nation. So. Yeah,
and there's that tension you pick up in the history of the Black church. Do you assimilate? Do you sort of do what Absalom Jones and become part of it? Or do you start your own thing? And he really does. He just says, we're going to start our own thing. And it was fun when we went down in November and did the tour. It was fun for me. I have to say, students don't realize it, but for me as a professor to watch one of my students in that pulpit telling that story, that was worth the price of admission for me. It was fun to let you see that. And also to let our students hear from a fellow student in the space where this happened, right? And I know you were nervous, but I mean, just even watching their faces as you were telling the story of like, you mean they drugged them out while they were praying?
Yeah.
Like, really?
Yeah.
And so what are some of the values you think that Richard Allen brings? Like, and some of this is, we're talking about Black History Month, we're celebrating African American Christians who, and Allen, of course, an hour and a half away.
Yeah.
Right? But, like, what are some virtues that you thought Allen, when you did your research on him, came across to you?
Yeah. I think one thing that's important to mention, I was even thinking about this as you were speaking, was that he really didn't have a choice. He didn't want to leave. If I remember correctly, the church had some project that wasn't finished, and Allen laments not being able to see it completed, but he had no choice.
Yeah.
He felt that at a certain point, the straw had broken the camel's back, and it was time to go. I think that shows a lot of character, especially in our day. And I'm a pastoral student. So we talk about churches, modern church, all day long. It's all my classes talk about modern churches, and it's really, really easy to complain. It's very, very tempting to complain about all the ways, even for me, as an unbeliever until I was 18 years old, who was in church, I saw a lot of these same issues. I saw a lot of these problems that I saw like, oh, that's not attractive. Nobody wants to deal with something like that. That's hypocritical. It's really, really easy to point those things out. But to watch someone like Allen be in a place, he says, even at the best, and I'm paraphrasing, that it felt like the African Americans in the church were a nuisance. That even on their best day, they were a nuisance to the church, to St. George's, and especially, obviously, to the white population, that they never really became unified. And I think it's something we can all aspire to do, to seek unity for as long as we can, even in the midst of things. We were talking about today, churches dividing over traditional or contemporary music. But for someone like Allen, he's worshiping with people who probably wouldn't step foot in his house, probably wouldn't step foot in his neighborhood.
Well, we know that.
Yeah.
We know that you wouldn't go into his neighborhood, yeah.
And probably wouldn't be seen with him on the street.
Right.
Who wouldn't ride a streetcar with him.
Right.
And he's with those people worshiping week after week until he finally reaches breaking point. I think that shows a love for the church.
Yeah.
And a love for the people there. But then I also think we can learn to see, like, at a certain point, there might be time to say enough's enough. So yeah, I think that kindness, I think that desire to seek the unity of the body, to seek the betterment of our fellow brothers, even amidst things, and it makes kind of the things that we divide over and the things that we separate over seem a little bit smaller. They are meaningful, they are important, they do touch the heart and the soul, but to watch people like that strive for unity, I think it should encourage us to strive for unity and push and push and push and push and push to get through our differences, that the world may know that we're Christ's disciples because of the love that we have for one another. So I think something like that, striving for unity is one thing I think I see in Alan's life that I think we could all strive
He wanted
for.
it.
Yeah, he did.
And I think, too, one of the things about Alan, his conversion to me is always fascinating,
Yeah.
right? Here he comes to faith at a revival in Delaware, which is in the late 18th century, so Delaware is still a slave state,
Yeah.
even though it is just a stone's throw from Philadelphia. He comes to faith, and then he really believes that if his master could hear the gospel this way, that he would free him.
Yeah.
And so just that thought in itself, that for this African-American slave, when he encounters the gospel for the first time, he puts together, if my master could hear this, he would free me.
Yeah.
And, of course,
He does.
he does,
Yeah,
right?
He
does. And, of course, he's got to work it off, and he's got to pay it up. And then there's a parallel there, too, I think, with Fred Douglass. I think when Fred Douglass comes to faith, we don't know a lot about it because he doesn't give us a lot of details. And, of course, some of the stuff he's trying not to tell us because he's a runaway slave in his autobiography. But both of those men came to faith, and they expected this to be different in the non-slave world. And they thought, if the gospel's going to make a difference it might be one thing in slavery it's this way, but in the non-slave world it'd be different. And both of them came up against the same experience, right? Where they went into a church of people who all said they believed in the gospel, and they're sitting in the black pew. And it's amazing to me when you know the Richard Allen story, and you read in the autobiography of Douglass, when he goes north, he goes to Connecticut, and where does he go? Methodist Church, because that's where he came to faith. He goes to Methodist Church, and there's a black pew. And Douglass's first response is, well, maybe this is just to help the unregenerate people, but once they get saved, once they hear the gospel and accept the gospel, obviously they won't need me to be sitting up here.
Yeah.
And he finds out, wait a minute, I've been here for a couple months, all these people profess to be Christians, and I'm still sitting here. And he goes down the street to the AME church. He goes down to the church from the denomination founded by Richard Allen, and that becomes his space. Those parallel stories, what do you do with that?
I think it always sticks out to me so much in every book that you give me is how often there's that refrain, like, how can these people be Christian and do this and live this way? How am I sitting here as an African American surrounded by all these white Christians and they won't sit with me, but they're Christians and I'm in a church? Like, how can that be possible? How can they both be true at the same time? And so that sticks out to me a lot. I think in terms of the parallel stories of Allen, of Douglass, I think for me it's an encouragement because they don't see the work finished. They're different in that they're incredibly educated, they're incredibly well spoken, they can draw a crowd, they're people are attracted to, and yet for them, I have no doubt the mountains must have seemed insurmountable so many times. It must have seemed so hard to get where they wanted to go so many times. I mean, I just read this book on Octavius Cato.
a contemporary with Richard Allen.
Yeah,
And,
in Philadelphia, and you see the whole book, just painting every picture of his life, and this accomplished person. You see him go from, you see his father, you see his family, you see his romantic relationships, you see him build and become this leader, teaching other black students, and they're impressive. They know Latin, they know Greek, they're incredibly impressive. And then he's shot in the street and killed.
Yep.
And it's just like,
and the guy got away with it.
and the guy just gets away with it,
Yeah.
and then they catch him, and it's
Yeah.
just like, what do you work so hard just and it must have been the same way for Allen and Douglas, to work so hard and still, but you can't sit in a streetcar.
Right.
So
right.
I think, for me, and as someone who lives in 2024, there's still ways to go, and there's still things that I see, that I wish I didn't, and that I would love to. You want it to happen overnight, but I think when you hear the stories of men like Allen and men like Douglas who worked so hard, and aren't going to know the fruits of their labor until they see it in eternity. They just had to work and work and work and work, and a lot of times look like they weren't producing anything.
And I think I always felt Allen and then when I learned about Octavius Cato and Fred Douglass, it speaks volumes to me that they stayed with the faith.
Yeah.
They were able to sort of separate out the gospel
Yeah.
and the bride of Christ from how some of the people who showed up on Sundays were treating them.
Yeah.
Because in some ways I think that's one of the greatest miracles of the black church, that it exists. Because you could see a situation where you would be an African American, you're at St. George's, you're being treated this way, and you're like, well, I don't need this, right? And unfortunately, you would walk away from everything. But they didn't. They were able to kind of see the difference and then be a prophetic voice to the very people who didn't see it. That is remarkable. So let's shift gears, because we got the history.
Yeah.
It's 2024.
Yeah.
What sort of trajectory does Richard Allen really set for the black church? You mentioned a little bit. How does he kind of set that up? And
I think dignity.
Yeah.
Dignity's,
unpack that a little bit.
Yeah,
'cause that's good.
Dignity is a big one. Dignity, in that if God has really said that I'm made in the image of God, I can have a church that also says I'm made in the image of God.
And celebrates
that,
Day.
no matter what anybody else tells me.
Yeah.
And I can, and in some ways, what they're experiencing is a lot of idolatry, is churches who are worshiping a God that really is made in their own image, and because He's made in their own image, there's not room for an African American. There's not room for an Irish person. There's a lot of these walls that are keeping people out, because there's a lot of idolatry that's unspoken. And I think what the black church allows the African American to do and allows us to do is to be dignified, not with the dignity that comes from self-love or some internal value or some working harder to seek in myself to find some treasure that's always, no, it's to take what God says about me and go to a worship service that affirms that in every way.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big piece for today is dignity, but also the great part about it is that you don't need to be in a black church to find that. And what I hope it is people look at it and see it as a conviction. Do people come here and find dignity, not in everything we're being told every day, because the human being is the greatest thing in the entire world, but because God gives us dignity. Because God is of incredible, immense, value, and we're made in His image, we get that value because of what He says that we are. So I think that's a big piece for today.
Yeah, that's good. And then I think the other thing I would mention too, I think it's important to bring out, is that because of the situation for the African American community in Philadelphia at that time, the black church does more than just provide dignity in worship. It provides dignity in learning, in education, in being.
Yeah.
right? And
Totally.
that's become such an important part of the Black church, and then that just continues.
Totally.
Right, it just continues, and I think that's so. Last sort of question,
Yeah.
and so I'm gonna quote Francis Schaeffer on
Yeah.
this one. Okay, so how shall we now live? What do we do with this? Right, we've read the books,
Yeah.
we've lamented, we are, we're trying to
Yeah.
look to the future. What do we do?
I think one of the biggest takeaways for me has been in learning in all this is some of these things are hard, but sometimes we need to suck it up.
What do you mean by that?
Paul tells Timothy, discipline yourself for godliness.
Mm.
Work at these things. Paul talks about his life of working for the gospel. He says, I beat my body and make it my slave.
Mm.
And I think sometimes things make us uncomfortable. Things seem insurmountable. Things seem, that's difficult, and so we forget. We turn our backs and we forget, and we keep living lives away from things that are uncomfortable. I remember I'm from Maine, which is an incredibly, the population is mostly white people, and so that was the kind of church experience I knew. And so when I went to Black church, that was something that was incredibly uncomfortable for me. I've never seen people dance and worship and move around, and I felt like a stick, I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do in this. It's incredibly uncomfortable. It's so easy, would have been so easy for me, and it was for a long time, to just, I don't want to do that. That's hard. It's when I moved to Philly when I was 14, and people just say I talk like a white kid. I don't even know what that means. That's incredibly difficult. That's incredibly uncomfortable. But nothing changes if you run. MLK's, the church hour is the most segregated hour in America.
Still.
It's not going to change if we're not willing to be a little bit uncomfortable.
That's good.
If I can't go to a church where people dance because I don't want to dance. If I can't go to a church where people sing different songs because I don't want to sing. If their sermon isn't long enough. At Epiphany in Philly, you worship for like an hour and a half. If you're uncomfortable with that and you're unwilling to lay that down, what's supposed to change?
Yeah.
And I think if we can't let some of these things go, not for the sake of inclusivity and diversity or whatever those things mean, for the sake of Christ first.
Yeah.
Because if I can see Christ in them, maybe I can see Christ a little bit better, and that's worth it to me. So I think if we become a little more willing to lay these things down and be a little uncomfortable and understand that maybe I need to write, I'm uncomfortable in this church that's predominantly Black and they're singing and dancing, that makes me uncomfortable, but I'm going to keep going anyway because I feel like that's something I ought to do. Or even to pray about it.
Yeah.
Lord, what am I unwilling to be uncomfortable with that's holding me back, that you would have me see? I think if we can't be willing to do those things, nothing's going to change. If everyone who disagrees with me is liberal, Marxist, and woke, or on the other side is a conservative, traditional, older white man, and we're just going to keep dividing on these lines and just push,
Yeah.
we'll never be able to meet in the middle. So I think that's something that...
And some of that is just the cultural baggage we bring in,
Yeah.
right? I grew up German, we don't dance, or
Yeah,
something like that,
yeah.
right? So what we're bringing in is some of these sort of city of man cultural artifacts with us, and don't realize this is my brother in Christ, and this is my sister in Christ, and in the new heavens and new earth, none of this is going to matter.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right. It's almost good practice
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, it is.
And I think that's always the challenge. How much of our culture are we bringing into the church versus the culture, versus the church and the story of redemption and God's story rewriting our narrative for us and say, well, yeah, in the city of man, visa, 1839, that's how it works in Philadelphia. But in the city of God in 1839, it shouldn't be that way because that's not God's intention. Yeah. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
Well, I've been appreciating going on this journey with you. It's been a blast to just see
it.
you process and learn through things. And again, the little dirty secret is the professor learns just as much because I have to read the book right before you do.
Yeah.
So, and then being able to kind of walk around in those spaces with you was fun. And so I just thanks for taking this time just to do this. And
Thank you.
I just hope that people watch this and kind of realize that There's a rich, rich history of cloud of witness for 2,000 years that we can look back on, and not to get sad and say, "Oh my gosh, the Christians are so messed up." You know,
Yeah.
that is the story of redemption, right? If you think the Christians are messed up, you read the Old Testament, right? So it's God working through these places, but hopefully there is reconciliation and
Yep.
unity in those spaces. So thank you.
Thank you.